right?
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ADP event today. My name is Danqi Hu. I'm from Peking University. I first would really want to thank Ayan and Steve for organizing ADP, which is a great series of inspiring talks that focused on accounting design issues, and for giving me the opportunity to moderate the last session of 2022, if I'm correct. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today, Peter Demerjian. Peter is the director of the School of Accountancy, at Georgia State University, a Michigan grad. Peter is well known for his research in the role of accounting in debt contracting, as well as his very innovative measure for manageriality. I was very fortunate to get to know Peter's research when I first entered the PhD program at University of Toronto, because Peter's paper was selected into our PhD curriculum. So I remembered many like, wow, this is cool moments reading his paper. So I look very much forward to Peter's talk today, and he will discuss a positive theory of information for debt contracting. A few words about the Zoom rules. We'll follow the ATP routine and give Peter some time to go over the first 2 or 3 slides before we open up for questions today. And then you can raise your Zoom hand or type questions into the chat box. And please turn on your camera if possible, so that we can have more lively discussion today. All right, Peter, it's all yours.
Marvelous. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I do sometimes feel like I should be paying royalties to Jeff Callan, because he's done more to spread my work around than anybody I know. So I'm really, really happy to be here. I appreciate the organizers selecting my paper. In fact, so I've been working on this paper for many years, 7, 8 years, something like that. For people familiar with my work in debt, I'm an empirical debt researcher, really. So I'll come around to exactly what I'm doing here, but it's not empirical debt work, of course. And so this is a little bit of a passion project for me, and I've been working on it. And as I kind of settled in, as I've kind of moved on in my career a little bit, I thought this is a great time to try to write this up, because I think this is really interesting and really important. And when I saw the ADP call for papers, it was almost like it was designed with this paper in mind. I'm like, man, I got to submit my paper to this, because this is the perfect place for this, because it's really about, it is really about accounting design. It's really about a measurement system like that. So I'm looking forward to talking about the paper itself. But I want to do something a little bit different here. So I'm not going to do this as like, the paper's so different, it's not going to be a normal workshop anyway. But I wanted to start out just share some of my thoughts about measurement systems, placing what I do here kind of in the context of what we've done in the literature, and hopefully explain. So I'll give, just to give you an example, I've been workshopping this paper, and often before I do my presentation, I'll be in an office visit. And some of the more outspoken people will say, so what are you actually doing? And I want to kind of make it clear what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, because it's a somewhat different approach to what we typically see in the literature. I like to think there's a place for this, but I feel like some explanation is probably in order. So to start, measurement system, right? When I think about designing something, I think about designing a measurement system. And of course, we need accurate measurement systems to make decisions, right? When we measure things, we're making decisions. And measurement systems are designed, or they evolve, right? So a lot of times when we talk about something being designed, it implies some sort of intentionality, some overarching vision. That might not be the case. This might be an ad hoc process, whereas things kind of change and evolve, the measurement system evolves with it, right? But we know that measurement systems are in place to address a specific decision or potentially multiple decisions, right? So you measure things because you want to do something, you need to make a decision, and you need to measure this. So sometimes the nature of the decision and who is making the decision is relatively straightforward. I just finished reading a book about Bitcoin. The whole first part of the book was about hard money, and it talked a ton about gold, right? And why gold is so useful as a medium of exchange. In order to have commerce in gold, you need to be able to weigh the goals. So you need a standard system of weight measurement, right? So if you think about this, having a standard set of weight measurements, and so you just don't look at something and say, well, these are the same, we don't even know. If you have a standard set of measurement, this is going to facilitate commerce. A case that might be perhaps more relevant or salient to people here, we have a system of measuring journal quality so we can assess tenure cases, right? So the decision is tenure, and we use journal quality to try to figure this out, right? In other cases, the users and kind of the decision objective is not as clear. Of course, here I'm thinking about a financial reporting system. A financial reporting system produces information. It is quite explicitly about decision-making, but the question is, what are those decisions and kind of how that goes? So let's break down this second part a little bit here. With financial reporting, when I'm talking about financial reporting, I'm talking about the external reporting system of business firms. So kind of the communication of information outside the firm. There's lots of potential users, and they're making lots of different decisions, right? So you have investors, creditors, customers, suppliers, regulators. When I teach my intro financial class, this is one of the first things I talk about. We're going to be doing a system here where we're producing external financial information, and people are going to use that information to make decisions. Should I invest? Should I sell my shares? Should I lend the money? Should I put a bigger tax on you? So there's all sorts of things. There's probably other users and decisions that could go in here. Now, the approach of the academic research vis-a-vis users and decisions has really evolved over time, right? So if we look at things in the pre-1968 era, research was largely normative, right? And when we talk about the normative model of research, it's just prescriptive. This is how things should be. And there was sort of an implicitly assumed user and decision, right? So just as an example, firms shouldn't use LIFO. It's bad accounting. You would see papers like this, right? This is what how the papers kind of work. And a lot of people, I see that Christina's kind of smirking, but because this is so outside of the paradigm of what we do in research now. But go back into the accounting review like in 1945 or something like that and read the papers. They'll just crack you up, right? Of course, we had this kind of revolution in accounting starting in roughly 1968. And this is where we took this positive approach, really following the kind of positive methodology that was rolling out of Chicago from the 50s in economics and spread to kind of affiliated business disciplines. And in the positive approach, of course, this is about explaining the world the way it is, right? So a little more precisely, developing predictions grounded in economic theory and kind of putting those predictions to the data. This was really how that paradigm functions. So for example, kind of tagging on to that normative question or normative statement, switching to LIFO leads to negative stock returns, right? So this is a classic kind of positive kind of study, right? And the work that many of us empiricists are kind of trained to do, right? I know from the day I got in there, Doug Skinner sat me down and said, this is how research works. You're going to use a theory, you're going to develop a prediction, you're going to test it, right? There's a lot of us do. Now, positive theories, positive studies often embed a user or decision in there kind of implicitly, right? So for the switching to LIFO leads to negative stock returns, implicitly by studying stock returns, we're assuming investors are the user, right? And then if we decide to study debt contracting, or if we decide to study some sort of supplier contract, we're basically making a kind of implicit assumption about who's using. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's something that doesn't take into account that there's a whole bunch of things going on here, and there might be some kind of conflicts. Now, that brings me to what I do. Oh yeah, actually, before I get there, academics, there's a lot of research that's debated on who the important users of financial reporting information are by studying how rules evolved and which decisions for which they'd be useful, right? And so it's almost kind of a revealed preference sort of thing. We look at this rule, we kind of come up with a sense, well, this should be useful for this, so these are important users of information. And we actually got into kind of some, I would say, some sort of spirited debates in literature. Right when I was starting on my journey as a researcher, was around the time when the JE review paper in 2001 came out. And if you read The Whole Thousand Watts, this is I think they say, what's the value of the value relevance literature? And then the counterpoint is provided by Barth, Beaver, and Landsman. And I remember reading this when I was quite a new guy, just a couple years in. I'm like, holy cow, this is serious stuff. We know this is important, right? Because we know that as we have standard setting, so this is, in other words, the design of the financial reporting system that we have, the direction of standard setting or the way the standards are, these actually influence the decision usefulness of the financial reporting information. So for example, if you look at Deshev's paper in 2008, The Accounting Horizons, about the move to the balance sheet focus, and then just in purely from a standard setting standpoint, FAS 157 and 159, just as one example, introducing expanding fair values, a lot of measurement rules and disclosure rules and so forth. This sort of changed the way financial reporting was able to be used by different users. So that brings me to what I do here. In this study, I take a somewhat different approach. So what I do is I explicitly specify our user decision context. In this case, the user is a lender, or what I call a creditor. And the decision context is the lending decision and all that goes along with that. And then what I do is I describe how information is useful in this specific decision context, right? So rather than taking the system as it is and trying to understand, well, given this system, what's it useful for? I abstract away from the system as it is. And I say, hypothetically, if you were building a system for this purpose, what would that system look like? So in a sense, it's kind of like if we were going to develop a first best solution to the problem of information for debt contracting, I think this is what it would look like. And then we can take and compare that to what we actually have to assess the usefulness. So this is, I think in a sense, it helps kind of triangulate some of the stuff we have in terms of theory of debt contracting, kind of from economics, agency, incomplete contracts, and so forth, with some of the empirical work we have. And I think it actually forms a little bit of a new foundation for the way we can think about this kind of work. One of the reasons I like it, and this is kind of at the center of the theory, is it allows for a holistic assessment of our current financial reporting system, and really any information system that's flowing into debt contracting, and to understand how this is useful for debt contracting purposes. And the punchline here, I'll give it away a little bit, there's multiple decisions in debt, and they often conflict with each other, right? So debt is actually, the information story there is a little more complex than maybe, for example, investing. So what I want to do here, it sheds light on the importance of creditors as a user of financial statements by understanding how useful financial reporting information actually is to creditors, right? So where I kind of started with this was a thought experiment. Again, I'm an empiricist, but I'm an empiricist that I've always tried to kind of think carefully about things, right? So if one were designing an information system for use in debt contracting, what information would it provide? That was kind of the fundamental question. Two sub-questions to go along with this. What decisions would the lenders be making with that information? And then what are the characteristics that would be useful to them for making these decisions? I'm going to summarize really briefly what I do, and then I'm going to be happy to open things up. So in this study, I do the following. I develop a set of 3 distinct but related decisions that lenders make in debt contracting. I explore different features of information. So these are kind of the first 2 kind of preliminary foundation pieces. And then at the heart of the theory is putting these 2 things together. So you have these different decisions, you have these features of information. What features of information are useful for the different decisions? And again, as I indicated before, the key thing here is different features of information make it useful for different decisions. And this is all within this overarching broader decision of loan contracting. This is kind of new, right? Because in debt contracting, when we approach this empirically, we typically do what I call kind of a partial equilibrium approach to this, in the sense that we look at one decision or the other without kind of acknowledging these overlap. They don't exist without each other. If one of them happens, the other one's there, but we kind of ignore the whole other piece of it. So when I talk about a holistic approach to information, this is precisely what I'm talking about. In the final part of the paper, I suggest a set of research directions that are tests that the theory kind of encourages, and kind of newer things, and I think new directions for research. I think this is hopefully something that would be useful for younger scholars who are looking for some directions to kind of take their work. I think given our time frame, I think it's unlikely we'll actually get to those research directions, but I wanted to mention there, if debt's something you're interested in, peek into the last part of the paper because there's some stuff there. One final thing. And again, that question, so what is this, right? People are asking me, what is this? Because it doesn't look like the type of research we typically see. This paper, in my view, is theory. I mean, it's fundamentally theory, but the problem is typically when we say theory to accounting academics, we automatically start thinking about mathematics and equations. This is not analytical theory. I think we've conflated that a little bit. This is what I call narrative theory. And there is a tradition of narrative theory, which rather than being based on assumptions and mathematical models and various proofs and theorem and so forth, it's based on arguments and persuasion and rhetoric and so forth. It fell out of fashion quite a while ago. As economics became increasingly mathematicalized. Really, I feel like the last great economist who really kind of wrote in this is Coase, right? So I'm not saying what I'm doing here. I'm not trying to compare it to Coase, but in terms of the style, in terms of the approach on this, this is kind of what I'm going for. So you'll see a few variables floating around in there just for kind of exposition purposes, but this is not a theory paper in that sense. So on that basis, I'm kind of aware, I think I suspect I'm going to face an uphill battle in pitching this to the journals, because I think journals don't totally know what to do with work like this. Now, that being said, I think there is potentially a real role for this kind of work, and for well-reasoned and well-grounded theoretical arguments. So that's kind of what I'm going for here. So hopefully it's something you enjoy. So with that, I was going to kick into talking about the lender's decisions and then the information and then the theory, but I'd love to open things up for some questions. Because if we just talked about this stuff the whole time, I'd be totally good with that because I love this. Who's up first?
I think I am.
Great.
Perhaps.
Hi, Peter. I really appreciate that kind of the beginning, because I guess that you get this question a lot about like, what theory are you talking about, right?
What is this even? Yeah.
And I like you can identify yourself as I'm an empiricist. This is not analytical theory. So one kind of alternative thought for you to consider is that this is a piece for empiricists to kind of structure our empirical settings. Like maybe the debt contracting or lending decision is probably more explicit, more observable to researchers, and then somehow they are more detailed settings we can explore compared to the equity market.
Yes.
And somehow there are many different layers of decisions, conditional or unconditional, and then happens in different situations. And then this will be a thought process, more like an empirical framework for us to think about how do we organize and identify those situations. Is that something that kind of the empirical framework?
Yeah, I don't even know if I could have said it better myself. Yeah, that really captures. So this is, I mean, this paper is clearly, this is designed for academics, right? So this is not trying to affect practice, it's not trying to affect standards. This is trying to give us, I would say a structure for empiricists to think about debt contracting. That's a great way of putting it.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe I need to pitch it a little harder in that direction. Right now, it's just kind of this thing. And this is precisely why talking about it is so good, because it can help me understand how this is going to be useful to people.
Thank you.
Ani?
Yep. Hey, Peter, this is a great initiative. I mean, something very personally close to me also what I do. And then I was very happy to see this kind of work coming from you, The first thought that crossed my head was the following. So when it comes to creating financial reporting for like satisfying certain decisions that users make, a couple of things come to mind. One is what is the objective of the user, in the sense that stock market user, a stock investor and a bond investor might have very different objectives in terms of what they're trying to achieve from their investment. The second thing is that what is the information set that is available to the user? So even within the world of debt, for example, a bank and a bondholder are subject to different kinds of information sets in front of them. So wouldn't that be something very fundamental, almost like a first order thing that you would have to take into consideration while getting into this initiative? And what were your thoughts about it when you started this stuff?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer the second question first. And then I'll ask you what the first one is again, because I forgot already. But so for the second question, when I approached this, I was very much of the view that I wanted to abstract away from any kind of institutional grounding that we have in the real world. Like this is meant to be really a theoretical framework and really hypothetical. So in terms of like banks versus bondholders, none of that's in here. I very comfortably acknowledge, obviously, bondholders. I mean, excuse me, we have a whole literature that suggests different types of lenders go to banks than go to the public bond market, specifically for their information environment and so forth. So that's absolutely a role here. I wanted to keep it more high level, which was just you want to borrow money without getting into which market you would be drawn to. Now, I'm gonna make a statement here that I might regret, but my feeling is everything that I have in here in terms of this structure anything that I've ever seen in the debt contracting literature can be fit into this structure, right? So could this be expanded or adapted to accommodate that there's different debt markets? I feel very confident of that, because this is what you're really talking about. What drives that debt market? It is different information sets among the different parties for that. So from that standpoint, point well taken. In certain ways, figuring out what the boundaries of this whole exercise were going to be was one of the hardest things, because the original version of this I wrote was over 50 pages. I'm here like, I'm getting lost reading it myself, and I'm the one who wrote it. So I need to make this something that's going to be where readers can really pin down what the fundamental things are. Are there extensions of this? Absolutely. And I think that it presents some opportunities there. Your first question was about the information set involved. Am I remembering that correctly?
So I was referring to both the objective of the investor
Right.
user, as well as the information set in front of them when they make decisions.
Yeah. So in terms of the objective, so here again, I'm very specifically focusing on a single explicit user, which is the creditor. And what I drill down to kind of in the first part is that the lender has one kind of overarching fundamental objective, and that is to get the loan paid back, should they opt to make it, right? And all the other decisions kind of flow up to that kind of single decision that goes there. So fundamentally, and you want to control agents problems, and you need to mitigate information problems and so forth, but that's all in the service of, should I make this loan, and will the borrower be able to repay the loan? So that's kind of the fundamental objective. Different from equity, of course, related, but different, right? Now, in terms of the information set, that was something, so I originally wrote this really focusing much more on the accounting, but then I'm like, this is more of a general purpose theory. So it really doesn't have to be accounting. This is just about how information is used, how information is processed, and how that flows into the creditor's set. So I keep this very, very broad as I work my way through. Really, the theory itself is invariant to whatever the information source is. This is really any and all information. And I think taking that very broad view is important here, because this applies to both what we have for financial reporting, but it's also going to be alternative information sources, anything ranging from information from disclosures from the firm, information produced by intermediaries, to the robustness of the salmon runs in the Northwest. I mean, it's anything. It's any information that possibly pertains to debt being repaid. And this is where I ran into problems at times presenting this, because readers in different ways would feel like we need to kind of hem this into just the financial reporting or something like that. I'm like, no, it's all information. But they're like, but there's other stuff. I'm like, yes, and it's all in there. So that's what, and I think it makes this a little more challenging, because I'm presenting this and I'm thinking about this, I think, more broadly than we typically talk about information in accounting, because obviously we're accountants and we're looking at this specific information source.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, we have Stupta.
So just following up on Manu's question, one other dimension in which they vary is sort of short-term versus long-term. And in debt analysis, we've spent a lot of time talking about liquidity versus solvency.
Yep.
And I wonder whether you make the distinction, because clearly short-term information is useful to both, but long-term information is likely more valuable only to a long-term investor, creditor, right?
Yeah.
So the nature of the information set is partly a function of the horizon, partly a function of where they are in the pecking order for repayment and all of that. So, so if you look at just one bondholder, that would be oversimplifying, but I think those traditional things give us a clue onto what matters. To whom.
Yeah, and this is actually something I've thought about, this dimension, because it plays pretty heavily into, I mean, I think some of the questions like income statement versus balance sheet and some of the more traditional accounting questions around this. My answer is fairly similar to what I just told Mani. This was something I abstracted away from in this case. I suspect what I have here could very readily admit this in terms of the nature of the information set. Is it short-term? Is it long-term? But more broadly, since the objective here of the lender is to understand the likelihood that the borrower is going to repay, the lender's information search, and then both ex ante and ex post, is going to go to the information that's going to give the sources that can give them most information to make that determination. So I think it fits in here. And again, For me, this was a question of how much detail do I go into, how much of the kind of institutional stuff that we know about do I go into here, or do I leave that for kind of the next iteration of this? Okay, thank you. These are great questions. So from here, I want to dig into the lender's decisions as I see them. And this is the piece, this was kind of the sort of the origin of this when I thought about this, which was that lenders do a lot of different things, and we need to think about those things and both how they're different, but how they relate to each other. So in my view, lenders have 3 distinct but related decisions regarding any loan, and each of these decisions creates demand for information, right? First, the lender must determine F of V, and this is really the only variable that I have in any sort of prominent fashion in the paper. V is the future value of the borrower. F of V is a distribution of the future value of the borrower. So we assume the borrower's value at loan maturity is stochastic. There's some cases where the borrower can pay. There's some cases where the borrower can't. So we have kind of a solvency state and then a default state. And the lender, in the process of deciding whether to offer a loan and the terms to offer the loan, wants to know what this distribution is, right? Now, I'm not suggesting the lender sits down and like, let me write out the parameters of F of V. This is more kind of impressionistic. They want to have some sense of how likely is default, probabilistically, and then if there is a default, what can they realistically expect to receive, right? And this is that whole ex ante, what we call screening, right? So this is not a new concept here. They collect information to screen the borrower and try to determine, should I make a loan and what's the terms I should attach to that loan? Okay, and I just want to say here, anybody with questions, this is kind of now free for all workshop style, folks. Please feel free to dig in and raise your hand. Second, when we move from the ex ante to the ex post, so now conditional on the loan being offered, the lender is going to assess the loan ex post to determine if the terms of the loan remain appropriate, right? So what we're talking about here is implicitly in the incomplete contracting realm, right? So you set up the loan under incomplete information, which means you know you might need to change some things afterwards. The lender is going to need to collect information ex post to determine if in fact they want to make those changes, right? I call this information for suitability. So we have screening information, we have suitability information, and then our third decision, which gives rise to information demand, is when the contract is set up with information contingent terms. And the lender is going to collect information ex post to determine if information contingent terms have been triggered. And this is what I call compliance, right? So I just want to say a few things here about this. What's kind of been out there and what's kind of new. Screening is a thing we see, and we've kind of studied some screening for debt contracting. The last two pieces, these two ex post pieces, a lot of times you'll see these kind of implicitly grouped under this term monitoring. Right. And this goes back to some of the Watson Zimmerman stuff and everything like that quite early on in agency literature and so forth. When you see monitoring discussed, it's typically compliance. That's really what these are looking for. And that's guided a lot of our studies, particularly through the 80s and 90s, looking at this compliance role. So that one's kind of out there. The suitability role, this kind of ex post assessment to see that the information embedded in the original terms are still appropriate. This one is, I think, as best I can gather, new to this work, right? So again, the sequence of events, the borrower approaches the lender to get a loan. The lender collects information to determine if they should offer the loan and what terms to attach to the loan. Assuming a loan is offered, as information is received ex post, the lender is going to look at that information and say, these are my original loan terms. Are they still okay? Or should we change the loan? And then there's also going to be terms in the loan, their information contingent, performance pricing covenants, and so forth. And they're going to use information to see if those have been triggered. Sudipta.
Sorry, is this a fancy word for renegotiation of terms?
Suitability?
Yeah.
So the renegotiation question comes up regularly. And the way I think about it, the assessment of suitability and the collection of information for suitability is kind of a precursor of renegotiation. I would say if there was one piece that I would seriously think about adding to this, I'd have something more explicit about renegotiation, because we know this is kind of a natural part of things. And I think it fits onto the that kind of ex post information story well. But with suitability, it's not renegotiation per se, because all this is just an assessment to compare the original loan terms to, I guess, if you were writing the contract with your updated information set, what terms you would assign to it. So just a kind of a comparison of those things. That can be essentially trigger it can essentially incentivize renegotiation if the lender learns that the terms are not what they want it to be. But here, it doesn't go that far because it's not going to necessarily force renegotiation.
So, I mean, renegotiation can be triggered by the sort of the compliance part. So that is almost automatic. You have to do something.
Yes.
And suitability is just something that isn't triggered by that, but they both ultimately
they feed into it precisely. So these are and this has actually been something where I think I've been working on making this more clear in the text, because I think it's absolutely something where I'm starting to round out to what this is. But suitability and compliance are certainly distinct, but they're absolutely complementary in terms of what role they serve, because in an incomplete contracting world, there needs to be some sort of trigger when you have this unsuitability of the contract ex post. Yep. I think Manny's next. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I don't want to take your job, moderator. You're doing fantastically.
Peter, any assumptions here regarding whether the loan will be held to maturity and the existence of a secondary market?
No, but we could build that in, right? So your point is very well taken. And this is, again, me saying I'm going to keep this very, very high level. I guess implicitly, we're kind of assuming that it's held to maturity. But honestly, if there is a secondary market, whatever information flows into that assessment of what happens out to maturity, that should travel with the loan and go to whoever is buying it, right? So then we could certainly frame this up as, here's the creditor's demand for information. If you're an investor on the secondary market, this is your demand for information. There should be parallels there. This should work out roughly the same way. Completely doable to build that in.
Got it.
Yep. Great question. Thank you. I don't think I can take questions from Ed Owens. Okay, I guess I can.
Oh, sure you can. I'm sitting here about this, thinking about this compliance versus suitability. I guess I've never explicitly seen those written down as two separate terms, but I guess related to Sudipta's point about, are we talking about renegotiation? I guess I've always thought about, the suitability assessment coming primarily or only when compliance
something's been triggered,
issues kick in, like when something gets triggered, right? Like a covenant gets violated, and then lenders will assess suitability.
Yeah.
But are you thinking about lenders are sort of, for some reason, trying to make suitability assessments on a continuing basis, like even in the absence of triggers?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
So in the absence of triggers, if the loan really turns out to not be what the lender had in mind, there's not a whole lot you can do about it, right? So one of the reasons these things are complementary, if you make the suitability assessment ex post and the lender's like, oops, these terms are nowhere near as strict as they should be because the information is revealed the borrower to be worse than we originally contracted on. Without a trigger for compliance, there's nothing they can necessarily do about this, right? Now, reason I think this is interesting is because even though everything here is framed as kind of a one-off interaction, we know realistically that these are going to be ongoing relationships. So there's always going to be a learning process from the lender out to the borrower. So even if they set up a contract, suitability suggests that they want to change the contract, they don't have a provision which set up to do that, you're going to be sure that when they next enter into a loan, either with this borrower or a different borrower, they're going to use this information essentially to affect their contract design in the future. So I think understanding when a loan is good, when a loan is bad. The other piece of this that I think is important to bear in mind, and again, outside of the scope of how I write this here, lenders are going to be learning about a variety of borrowers. Let me put this a different way. Lenders are not going to just be learning about the individual borrower when they assess suitability, but that might give information about other borrowers in their portfolio. So I think that understanding, so they might be looking at peers, they might be looking at customers and so forth, and this could provide some information potentially for their other contracts as well. Now, again, not in here, but it fits the framework.
Yeah, I guess to me, in my mind, that's I guess the new dimension here is thinking about information needs concerning suitability
Yep.
In the absence of triggers.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I was at a conference someplace in the fall, I think the WashU conference, and there was a debt contracting paper that was looking at private firms and private information and everything like that. And the presenter was talking about the information. People getting really hung up because they're like, well, there's no covenants. So why are they looking at this information? And someone who had seen this presentation at AAA kind of looked at me and they said, this is suitability. I'm like, exactly. So it made me feel like there's definitely a role here. And again, when we tend to think very much like, I know you and I, because we worked in that area so much, we think about the private loans with the covenants and everything like that. There's going to be other settings, I think, where there might be other mechanisms potentially in place. So I think it is. And this is kind of the new thing. And yes, that's good. And it's great to talk about.
Then we'll have Alina.
Yeah, and I think actually, so I raised my hand right before you answered the question, but yeah, I struggle with the suitability with the kind of keeping in mind contract law. So and discussion of contract law and what you can and can't do, and to the extent that it makes no sense to invest effort and money in collection of data, which is useless. But then I think information transfer, in my mind, is the most valuable, and I guess the only reason to proceed with the lender's perspective with like the suitability assessment is
If there's no trigger.
Right, if there's no trigger, right, of course.
Yeah.
So I think that one is very clear to me, but if there's no trigger, and not even for, again, so kind of you said for the same or for others, just volume based for others, right? That's where you really, I think, probably can deploy this information to maximum benefit to you. Is that you know? And I was trying to think, I'm like, what you know, again, so kind of with the very simple example of mortgages, right? And once if you lose your job the day after the mortgage is signed, right? That's irrelevant for that specific mortgage, and you will never, that relationship is forgone, but in terms of the volume of what they could have learned. So I think information, I would definitely, I think you've answered it, but again, I think to me, information transfer is the one that makes sense.
And I could be a little more explicit. I think the other thing that is important to note in terms of the nature of that transfer, I kind of tuck in there with the screening that different lenders, the amount that they screen is going to be a function of their kind of competence and experience with screening. So are they good at collecting information, and can they process that information quickly? This suitability actually, so I think about it as, if you assess suitability, even if there's nothing you can do about it, maybe as a lender, you get a little bit smarter. Maybe you understand, so if you're talking about mortgages, you're going to have all this information about the borrower up front. And if you learn a week later that they lost their job and blah, 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 you can plug that into the algorithm, and this might affect the way you screen things in the future. So there's the information spillover can be to other loans. It can be to concurrent loan portfolio. It can be to future decisions. So, but
in some sense, I think that seems like then suitability is really a subset of the one that comes before and after. So it really is a subset of screening and compliance, because again, in the absence of those two, it's not, it does not have, it doesn't do anything for you.
Right. Yep. No, I agree. But since these things are all kind of related, I feel like it's distinct enough where it deserves its own space. That's kind of my take, but your point is very well taken.
So I tend to think about these two, the difference between these two in terms of good news and bad news.
Okay.
So if the firm experiences bad news, they're likely to violate a covenant or at least get close to that covenant. And once that happens, you're likely to be thinking about renegotiation. Are they violating or not? But what happens if the firm experiences good news? Mm-hmm. You know, they get a FDA approval, or they get a new patent or whatever that has high market value. Mm-hmm. Well, now the firm is going to say, I want to lower interest rate and I want a larger loan to commercialize this.
Yep.
Right. So that's information that they're going to take to renegotiate. And the implicit threat is that if you don't give me those terms, I'll just go to another.
Just refinance elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that the compliance one is clearly only bad news, but the suitability one can be both good and bad. And
I'm going to disagree mildly on the compliance only being bad news, because there are actually loan terms that can both punish when things are bad, but actually reward when things are good. Are you familiar with the performance pricing provisions?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can move up or down the grid depending on the way it's set up. So definitely, and that's one of the key compliance terms.
But
Because
that's
it's just
not violating anything. That's just an automatic thing, right? So
yeah, but I mean, compliance is not just about violating. Compliance is just about information contingent terms. So here's some information. Does it change the contract term in some sort of explicit fashion? Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot. So that what you're talking about is what I call lender initiated versus borrower initiated renegotiation. I've thought about this a ton. I'm hesitant to cross promote my work, but this was a big central piece of my uncertainty and debt contracting paper that I have in RAST in 2017. And the whole idea there, what my contention there was that covenants, financial covenants are in place to facilitate lender initiated renegotiations when there's information received, I suppose. Had a terrible time publishing it, honestly, because I had a really hard time convincing people that uncertainty mattered. I think if we had this structure in place, I think it would have been a little bit more palatable to people.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
This is another wild thought. I think I actually got screening, suitability, and compliance. I'm thinking about whether you are able to use some disclosure theory or information economics kind of like analytical model to define them. So this is just my very naive understanding by reading your piece. Screening is ex ante decision. That decision maker or information gathering decision maker has to make decision before they see any signals. Right? So like everything is still related to the forward-looking future value of the borrower.
You're actually getting into the theory, which is exactly where this goes. So yes,
okay.
Great.
And the suitability, the way you define it is actually they start receiving some exposed signals. They keep doing the Bayesian updating, but still it's regarding the future cash flow or future state of the borrower. But compliance is very different. It's all about historical transaction and whether that actually consistent with the written promises or unwritten promises.
Yes.
Is that the correct kind of like?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first half of the paper right there. That's exactly right. Yes.
So my question is that it seems very general. It can speak to any kind of the contracting, right? If it's a customer suppliers, I screen for potential suppliers and ex post, I want to see whether that supplier is still suitable, and then I want to verify whether some of the contractual terms. So is that where you are thinking? Is that it's not limited to just step contracting, but just in general, any contracting practices not related to.
So I would say this should work for any explicit contract. So any written contracting setting. Parts of it would absolutely apply to an implicit contract setting as well. But really, yeah, this should work for all of these.
Thank you.
Shibi?
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
So I think I came across a paper on JFE, Dennis and Wang 2014. They actually document that even in the absence of covenant violation, there are a lot of renegotiations.
Yes.
How is this suitability relating to that? Because I think that paper is trying to say that the lender can have some sort of control even without the violation.
Yeah, so there's a couple, I have a couple answers to this, and it really depends on whether it's borrower or lender initiated. So if, and this goes back to Sudipta's point to some extent, if the ex post information reveals the borrower to be better than the terms embedded in the original contract, right? So like that, FDA approval, patent comes through, something like that, just unexpectedly good earnings. The borrower is going to say, hey, our interest rate is too high, and this loan should be bigger and so forth. And assuming that the borrower is in fact that good and we have a relatively liquid loan market, lots of lenders, lots of borrowers and so forth, the borrower should be able to go to the lender and say, hey, you need to renegotiate with me, or I'm going to go to another lender who's going to give me the terms that I want. And the lender has every reason to accept that, right? Because the borrower has a control right. So that would be what I call the borrower initiated renegotiation. I don't know if that's what Dennis and Wang are talking about. I haven't looked at that paper in a while. On the other hand, and I know this also shows up in this, there's a Roberts and Sufi JFE about renegotiation. And what they find is that lender initiated renegotiations. So renegotiations where the ex post information reveals the borrower to be worse than the original contract terms. You'll see renegotiations, even if the covenant's not violated, because I think what happens is everybody looks at it and they're like, yeah, this covenant's going to be violated. The trend is not good. So I think that the way they frame it is this is a preemptive move, just to kind of save the trouble. I think that it probably makes things a little bit easier, because I think once the covenant's formally violated, there's probably some sort of legalese and whatnot, extra effort that goes in there. If they know the covenant is going to be violated, or if the trend is strong enough in that direction, I suspect they can just jump out in front of it and rewrite the contract to accommodate whatever goes along with that. Then there's no formal waiver and some of that stuff.
Sorry, just one more relevant paper. I think Yi-Wei Dou's dissertation on, I guess, how I guess the same ratio becomes not suitable over time. That's my impression of that paper. I think that also relates quite closely to your suitability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at his paper lately, so I'll revisit that. Because that definitely sounds like it's in the right area.
Thanks.
Okay. Are we really at 11:45? We should have made this a 2-hour session. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to here. And this is just summarizing what was on the last few slides, because I'd like to talk about the information features, which is a kind of key piece of this. Here's a debt contracting timeline. We have contract negotiations, we have loan initiation, we have loan maturity. I break this into an ex ante and an ex post period, and that's just relative to when the loan is issued. And here's the 3 decisions. And I just wanted to kind of summarize what those decisions are precisely. For screening, the lender determines F of V, and here I have it actually given A and S, and this is action and state. I'm not going to have time to talk about that. That's a part of this I really actually enjoyed a lot, because I think a lot of times we worry a lot about action. We don't talk about state enough, and I actually think that lenders are really worried about action. They're worried about state, and they're worried about how action and state interact. So if that's something you're interested in, check that part out. Given that determination, and they use kind of a expend resources trying to find as much information as they can in a cost-effective fashion. And then they're going to determine whether to offer loan terms, and should they offer a loan, what the appropriate terms are going to be. So that's the ex ante. Ex post, there's 2 demands for information. Suitability, again, as new information is received about the borrower. And this can be from the borrower, this can be from someone else about the borrower, or this can be some sort of spillover type effect that helps you learn about the borrower, but it's not specifically about the borrower. All that information is going to flow into suitability to determine, is the initial contract still suitable? Do the initial loan contract terms still seem right to the lender? And then finally, based on contractable information that's received after loan initiation, is the borrower in compliance with any terms that are written on that contractual information? So this is the first piece of this, which is these 3 decisions. And this is just to break down a little what those decisions are. The second part of this, and what comprises the second of the kind of foundation pieces of the theory, is the features of the information. And I'm going to try to go through this quickly enough, and it's fairly straightforward so that I can show what the links of the theory are. So what I do here is I look at 3 features of information, and try to determine whether these make information more or less useful for the 3 decisions. That's what the theory really does. So if we can get some proxies to measure these features of information, then we can test some stuff about the theory. The first feature I look at is hard and soft information. I follow the definitions of Liberti and Peterson. I talked about this in a workshop, and someone said that's just a loosey-goosey thing and everything. I think it's pretty good. I think it's a nice way to define this. We could be a little more rigorous. I guess I could be a little more rigorous, and I'm kind of working on that. But in terms of kind of borrowing from their definitions, hard information is quantitative, easy to store, and objective. Right? If we're thinking about information that might be useful in debt contracting, transaction records, prices generated on organized arm's length exchanges, information subject to external validation. So think about audited financial reports. This is all, I don't think this is controversial. Soft information, qualitative, context specific, and subjective, right? Forecast, projections, prices from related party transactions, private information not subject to external validation. I think all other things equal, people prefer hard information. It's clearly more reliable. You can trust it more. But soft information often brings some useful features. It's timely. And there's some information that's just kind of hard to make hard. still can be useful in the contracting realm. So that's the first thing, hard and soft information. And I want to make it clear here. And in the paper, I think I kind of talk about these kind of dichotomously. This is really meant to be more on a continuum from completely soft information to completely hard information. There's kind of a continuum in there. Question?
So your examples of soft information include a lot of quantitative information, even though you're calling it qualitative.
Can you give me an example?
Forecasts, projections.
Okay, yeah,
quantitative
that's a
numbers,
fair point. Yeah.
prices from related party transactions.
Yes.
That's as
Yeah,
objective.
so I feel like, I guess, maybe I should be a little more precise about this, because I feel like qualitative information is inherently soft. Really, quantitative can be either, and it depends on the nature of kind of the verifiability behind it. Yeah, that's a fair point. Absolutely.
I don't think that even that will work, because I mean, suppose you say that the customer, I mean, the seller has delivered something to you. I don't know whether that's quantitative or qualitative. I mean, what does it mean? But that sort of shows you that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would
earned.
be, yeah, I mean, I think that information would be much harder if you said they delivered 8 containers of something to me, as opposed to say they just delivered to me. So yeah, and that's kind of that continuum. But yeah, your point's very well taken. And I think there's certainly, after the last workshop I talked about this, I think I need to be a little more precise in how I'm doing these. And there are some papers that go at this a little bit more rigorously. All right. So that's the first feature. Second feature is what I call temporal orientation. And I'll clarify this a little bit afterwards, but the way I have it currently written, reflective information refers to past events and transactions. So it reflects something that happened in the past. Predictive information refers to events and transactions that have not yet happened. Before I get to that, so when I originally wrote this, I had this framed up as forward-looking and backward-looking, right? And part of me still really likes that. The problem I ran into is you can have some information that relates to past events and transactions, but actually provides information about future events and transactions. And I'm here like, backward-looking, forward-looking they feel like mutually exclusive designations to me, right? So my point here is to say, you can have information that's reflective, that reflects things that happened in the past, but is also predictive. So these are not mutually exclusive categories, right? Something that's worth pointing out here, although hard and soft and the temporal aspects of information are related, they do differ. A lot of times when we think about predictive information, we think, well, predictive information is inherently soft information because you're kind of projecting forward what's going to happen. A couple of examples, I think that reflective soft information is fairly straightforward. Company did very well last quarter, right? That's a piece of information that is reflective, talking about the past, but is quite soft in terms of its content. Hard predictive information, order backlog. Of course, order backlog is not as good as sales, but such that it is predictive of sales, I think it's useful. Question?
So you're just trying to say historical cost versus fair value?
I don't want to get into that. That absolutely fits in here, right? So yeah, that's definitely a hill I do not want to die on, and I want to keep it more general than that. But yeah, that's in there, right? Okay.
Peter, just a quick reminder that we are like 8 minutes away from the end of the recording.
Yeah.
And
well,
then
there's no tables to
according
get to, so I'm okay.
Yeah, according to Ayang, some people may want to hear, like some participants like to hear your thoughts on the implications for future research, if that's on your.
Oh yeah, it's in the slides. All right, well, you know, let me talk about the last feature of information, tie these together in the theory, and then we can jump to where we need to get to. The final feature of information I look at is permanence and transience. This one's I've grappled with a little bit, but I'm kind of present it as is for now. Permanent information are those things that are expected to persist into the future. Transient information will not persist into the future, but only affects the current period, right? A lot of times when I think about transient information, this is associated with terms such as shocks, non-recurring, one-time items when we think about this in financial reporting. Okay, I'm going to skip these slides because I summarized them here. And this is if you're looking at what is the heart of the theory, this is the heart of the theory. With screening information, It admits both hard and soft information. These can both be useful for screening. So we know the screening has forecasts, so it has soft information. You got to weight those appropriately, but ultimately, these are all admitted. In terms of predictive or reflective, this is going to be predictive information. You want to have predictive information because what you're looking at is the expected future value. And then finally, you're going to be focusing on permanent aspects of information because anything that's transient won't have an effect on that maturity date value of the borrower. Flipping down to the bottom line with compliance, I don't know that I did not mute my phone. Flipping down to the bottom line for compliance, unlike screening, compliance requires hard information, right? You can't calculate covenant compliance or other hard information terms using soft information. It's insufficiently verifiable. Compliance information will be inherently reflective. It's going to be related to past events and transactions. For example, you're not going to have a term that is contingent on a forecast. And then finally, compliance will admit both permanent and transient items. Suitability is kind of in the middle on both these dimensions. It admits hard and soft information, but arguably that information might need to be a little harder than what's used for screening. It can be predictive and reflective. And ultimately, it can admit permanent and transient items, but it might be weighted a little bit more towards permanence. So this is the theory. Is that a new question?
Yep.
Cool.
So for the compliance part, I understand that it's triggered by the past performance.
Yep.
But isn't your decision on whether you're going to waive it or not going to be based on predictive information? So don't you need that as well?
Yeah, and that's where suitability and compliance are kind of complementary there, because the decision related to the compliance is going to be based on that suitability. So for example, if you have a provision that's triggered, so a compliance kind of triggering, you're going to use the information you had in suitability. And you might look at that suitability and say, nope, this is actually fine. I just set this provision wrong in terms of the information. So with the compliance, I mean this very specifically just about the triggering, not about the actual decision that goes along that kind of follows that triggering. That's more of a suitability kind of story. Okay, so little low on time here. So that's a theory. This is kind of a theory. And from here, this is where things kind of flow out to the paper. So what I want to do, since there does seem to be some interest in the future research ideas, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. And I'll just try to get through a couple of these. If we need to kind of cut things off, I can jump to the slide. I can also stay online a little afterwards if people are interested in hanging out here. But one future direction for research, recent years have seen a shift in U.S. accounting standards away from the income statement towards the balance sheet. This is something I've studied myself. One of the key manifestations of this is fair value of accounting, of course, FAS 157, 159, and a bunch of other rules that kind of push in that direction. Testable implication, if you look at the theory, so what we've looked at before, and I actually have a paper on this, is that the compliance use has been compromised by this. I think something that's maybe more interesting ultimately, and this is a paper I like a lot, but financial reporting has become more useful for screening while it's become less useful for compliance, right? So that's actually something that's testable. We can see, are they screening better? In other words, are the initial contract terms actually less likely to be renegotiated, for example? So there's a few really clean testable things that fall out of this. I'm going to skip that one because this is one that was I've thought about for a long time. And that's earnings quality, right? So most people are very familiar with earnings quality. Typically, when we look at earnings quality, it's been assessed with a focus on decisions related to equity investment. It's also been assessed with measures that are related to equity fundamentally, right? This theory suggests a new avenue for earnings quality research, focusing on multiple decisions that lenders make, right? So testable implication here is that lenders face a series of trade-offs due to the set of decisions they make. Research could develop multiple metrics of earnings quality for debt that contrast and rationalize the trade-offs, right? So to me, this is something that should be done. So I actually tried to do this probably 10 years ago with some co-authors, and I hadn't really formed this kind of fully. I'm like, well, they're doing this and they're doing this, so shouldn't this be different? So as I kind of think about this to me, and you actually, if you go into the Deshoga and Strand earnings quality piece from JE, they touch upon this a little bit. If you look at kind of the debt section, they have a very small section on debt because earnings quality really hasn't focused on this. When you think about it, what's going to be useful for screening is going to be diametrically different from what's useful for compliance. And the lenders are often relying on a single information source from the financial statements to at least do some of this, right? So I think to me, this is really interesting. So to conclude, 3 decisions: screening, suitability, compliance. Each creates distinct demand for information. And there's different desirable features depending on the decision. So my hope here is that the theory has implications for how we view the role of financial information in debt contracting, as well as how it interacts with other sources of information. And as I say thank you, because we're 1 minute away, as I say thank you for being here, for all your great feedback and questions, I want to share this slide right here, which is the call for papers for the ADP in the spring. I don't know if Ayang or anybody else wants to say anything about this.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think, thank you for including this. I will also send out a reminder. I think Sudipta has one additional question. Yeah.
So given that there's a large literature on conservatism, which claims that it is motivated by debt contracting.
Yes.
I'm surprised I didn't find a single mention in this talk, even though it's an aspect of information.
So do you think that that should be set as a feature, like one of the features of information?
Well, that's what people in the literature have been saying for at least 30 years. 50 years. Going back to, I mean, you can go back to Watson Zimmerman and see that.
Yes. Yeah, that is a fair point. The features of information that's kind of the most, I feel like the most developmental part of this project. So do you think something like contrasting the degree of conservatism versus the degree of neutrality?
Well, I think it's sort of the asymmetric payoffs, right? Debt holders on average care more about the downside than the upside, and that makes them different from equity holders. So as Ayang was saying, if you just have a general theory of information that can apply to any contract, then this contract, your theory applies to equity investors as well. There's nothing that makes a debt contracting per se instead of equity contracting or supplier contracting, whatever. But one of the things that makes equity holders and debt holders different is that their payoff structures are different. And that creates,
and the explicit contracting, I think, matters as well.
Again, the dividends are based on retained earnings, which is an explicit contract too. There are things like that.
Dividends are definitely, I feel like they're in a little bit of a different zone, particularly with the debt capital being contractually required to be paid back to that capital. It's a point well taken. And this is kind of me again.
Preferred equity, I mean, we can go into the various shades of gray, but my point is that right now you don't do anything with debt contracting incentives, you know, the structure of the incentives. And I think, given the amount of literature that's out there, that's like a big hole.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Thank you. Okay, I will, I guess I'll wrap the formal part. Does anybody